In 2005, Nigerian musician Labaja sang Kosi Fashion Con Toju Tiwalo Yuru Ati Bubanye Pelukele Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at one of my favourite explorations, and that's Aishaayanx. And that's looking at the evolving nature of Aishaayanx, Yoruba fashion, and by extension also Nigerian fashion. Right now Nigerian fashion is talked about quite a lot. People like it, people love it. It's definitely in. Now, for those who may not understand Yoruba, the lyrics that I recited means that there is no fashion that surpasses our own, the Yorubas, with Iru Ati Buba, the blouse, and the wrapper, and the very elaborate gele. And before I go into this topic a bit generally, I'm just going to talk about some Yoruba points just very quickly. After all, Aishaayanx is a Yoruba practice, so I think that's fair. The Yorubas love fashion, and this has been a fact throughout the ages. Similar to many other African groups, we don't have much written documentation. We do, however, have oral ones, and our languages are able to reveal a lot about ourselves, hence why language preservation is so important. The Yorubas say ti Yoruba sonu owe lafingwa, meaning if the words get lost we find it in proverbs. And when it comes to modes of dress or discussing clothing, we say things like Aishaayanx katokeyan, which basically means we greet the clothing first before we greet the person. Traditionally in Yoruba fashion, women will wear the blouse and the wrapper, with men wearing the fila, the hat, and the abada. To be honest, I have talked about this quite a lot now. We don't really see Iru Ati Buba, the wrapper and blouse, being worn a lot by the younger generation anymore, if at all. We see all types of styles, particularly the corset, which seems to be reigning supreme right now. So there's less of Yoruba native being worn these days. Materials that tend to be used for traditional clothing are usually ashoke, adire, lace. Ankara was really popular at one point. There was also a time where Senegalese like damask, the really stiff material, it was really popular, and that was the choice. Overall, so many different materials have had their place in the spotlight. So in contemporary times, the term Aishaayanx has woven itself into social discourse. It tends to creep up when there's an event happening, be that a birthday, a wedding, a funeral, a naming ceremony, and before you know it, you have a bill. Aishaayanx has been long associated with the Yorubas and by extension the Nigerian Owambes. Owambe tends to be spelled with an M for some reason, but it actually should be an N. I just had to point that out because Yoruba literacy is so poor and I hate it. The practice has been embraced by so many different ethnic groups. Last summer there was an uproar on social media because these girls from Guinea, I believe, wore Aishaayanx for a wedding, and people were saying it's cultural appropriation, and some of the critics were also stating that Aishaayanx can only be worn by the bride and groom, which is very wrong, mind you. Aishaayanx can be worn by anyone, not just the bride, not just the groom. But I will be discussing some of the history and politics of dress in a part 2 to this video, but right now we're going to be discussing the problems with Aishaayanx. Lovely.
I'm gonna admit that Nigerian wedding culture is toxic, especially Aishaayanx. Like, there are many things I could go on about, but you see that Aishaayanx thing, I'm so sorry, I find it so stupid. Why would you want people to wear a specific fabric and outfit to your wedding and you can't afford to give it to them?
The term Aishaayanx translates to family cloth. It's a contraction of the phrase Aṣọ Dajo, the clothes that the family put together. According to Akinwumi, the practice is actually associated with clothing provided by family as grave goods. That's rather morbid, sorry. The details do vary from region to region, but what we do understand is that there was a contribution of cloth as a funeral rite. Captain Ross, who was a resident of Oyo during the colonial era, documented, a general announcement is then carried to all the relatives, each of whom on coming to mourn the loss will bring one or more cloths as means permit. For the purpose of wrapping up the corpse, the number of wrappings is assigned to the outsider of the importance of the corpse. Similarly, Samuel Johnson noticed that it was customary for relatives to bring a piece of cloth for the burial. So Clark argues that Aishaayanx seems to have developed from purchasing new cloths as funeral goods, and also the tendency for small groups of women, particularly co-wives and sisters, to dress rather similar on festive occasions, of course. Clark goes on to argue that it's important to note that Aishaayanx as we know it today had its actual origins in European style of dress. In fact, it was only later on that we see the use of local materials such as Aishaayanx being used in this manner, which is a really important observation to note. The colonial era had such a huge influence on Nigerian society. We still see its horrible hand today. Back then, of course, the European way of dress, the fabrics, it was what was in vogue. vogue, not native wear. Foreign things such as clothing was linked to class, as was education at the time. So most class people, at least in the public formal spaces, would be wearing, if you were a man, suit and tie, a lady, you'd wear dress. Akinwumi writes that in the 1930s, Lagos churches prohibited native wear unless it was for special occasions such as funerals, birthdays. What other special occasions do we have? Christmas. So native wear was pretty much banned by the church, and it was only later that the coordinated style of European dress began to extend to traditional materials and styles, and it spread rapidly amongst the educated elite. And here we start to see the beginning of what we now conceptualize as Aishaayanx in the modern age. So as the name suggests, the practice was confined to family. Aishaayanx, family cloth. But what we tend to call Aishaayanx nowadays isn't Aishaayanx. It's actually the concept of Ebejoda, which means group uniform. Over time, Aishaayanx has basically encompassed that. Blood relations is no longer a requirement for participation. In the 20th century, Aishaayanx and native fabrics gained a lot of political importance. It became a symbol of resistance to European influences, and by wearing traditional clothing, politicians were seen to be aligning with more pro-nationalist sentiments. Leading politicians in the years surrounding the lead up to independence in the 1960s were noted to select their clothing without any specific regard to ethnic origin, just as long as it wasn't European. For example, Tafawa Balewa, he was the first Nigerian Prime Minister, by the way, was in fact often photographed wearing Aishaayanx. Obafemi Awolowo, who was Yoruba, was frequently pictured wearing Aishaayanx as well. By incorporating Aishaayanx in this way, it was seen as creating a almost pan-Nigerian collective identity, as opposed to it signifying one's ethnic group or difference. Okay, let's bring it back to the present day. As I touched on in the beginning, Aishaayanx has become huge. It's a huge cultural phenomenon, and it's just everywhere. I don't know if I've explained this already, however, the practice is supposed to signify unity, support, fraternity, all of that nice stuff. And for those who are partaking in the celebration, they will tailor their fabric to a design of their choice. I'm guessing that's a cool set. Although in the past it was said that the practice was characterized by a certain level of uniformity, not just in the fabric but in the style. Of course, that's not really the case anymore. There are so many different designs, one fabric, 20 designs maybe, and I do think that's a good thing in and of itself. It's given a lot more rise to individualistic styles and ways of expression. Erin Rice in her dissertation observes, in a sense, the factory print allowed Aishaayanx participants to stretch the limits of uniqueness within conformity. In doing so, Lagos citizens reinvented the notion of a national or cultural specific fashion. Indeed they did. So how does this practice even work? When planning an event, the host selects their preferred fabric of choice. They mark it up and they sell it on to their lovely friends and families. And those who have been deemed worthy of being part of the Aishaayanx cohort, they are expected to buy the material whether or not they attend, although that may differ from person to person, but generally, yeah. Whether you go or not, it's seen as a gesture of support. But over time, it has become burdensome and contentious for many. And I'm not being dramatic, people complain all the time. Aishaayanx, how scary. Just joking. So the first issue that I've noted out of 3 are the financial issues. An academic paper titled "The Ethics of Aishaayanx Culture in Nigeria" highlighted that the practice carries a markup of 20 to 50%, although I won't be surprised if the figures are a lot higher. Obviously, the markup substantially increased the cost for the attendees. They're not only buying the cost of the fabric at a premium, but they also have to pay for tailoring. So things can get really expensive and annoying. Let's say, for example, the host buys the fabric for £50 and they mark it up at 50%. Let me get my calculator out. I do not like numbers. The attendees will now be paying £75. That's £25 more. Is that fair? You tell me. The study also revealed that those who don't have the financial means to participate and purchase the fabric do resort to borrowing money. But let's rewind to the 20th century for a second. In the 1930s, Nigerian newspapers were flooded with complaints. Men, in particular, were complaining about the financial burdens of Aishaayanx. One editorial in the Lagos Daily News described expensive mourning outfits as one of the bad customs that people couldn't afford. And by the mid-1940s, Aishaayanx wasn't just seen as a financial strain. It was singled out as a primary cause of sexual promiscuity, alongside debt and marital problems. Allegedly, Well, it was men that were saying these things, so allegedly. I support women's rights and wrongs. Allegedly, they were sexually promiscuous over Aishaayanx. This sour mood was also captured by playwright Hubert Ogunde.
I write the story of what is happening in the society. That's how I believe it. It may be social, may be religious, may be folkloric, and may be political, if you like.
In his 1946 play, Human Parasites, this told the story of Aduke, who kissed 1,000 lovers just for the sake of Aishaayanx. Oh god, Back to the Future. Critics and disgruntled partygoers do tend to say that the event organisers enforced Aishaayanx not to just recover the cost of the party, but to also make a profit. And this is what pisses everyone off, because how greedy. The thing is, when a custom turns into a profit-making venture, a very unscrupulous one, it really does bastardize it, and it's annoying. People are constantly complaining about the billings, be that the £100, 200k, whatever. So it does raise serious questions about whether these practices should be encouraged and continued the way that they are if it does amount to a form of extortion within our community. Next we have social issues.
You see that table over there? Don't serve them anything. Don't serve them drinks. Not even souvenir.
But madam, what if we now have surplus?
Then take it home and feed it to your dogs. Or possible. You see this table? Nothing for them.
At its core, Aishaayanx signifies togetherness, which is a key part of Yoruba culture and also the broader Nigerian culture. We have a very collective society as opposed to the individualistic nature of the global north. So we do show up and celebrate together because that's just really important and part of our bonding as community. Good example in the Yoruba culture is when a host is greeting their guests for attending their celebration, they would say Amari Ribarashi, which essentially translates to we'll continue to find good things to celebrate together. Nonetheless, there are so many reasons why one can't participate in an event, or they can't attend, or they can't wear Aishaayanx. For those who are unable to participate in purchasing the Aishaayanx and thereby wearing it to the event, they may be labelled by the celebrant as a bad friend, unsupportive, whatever. There is indeed a lot of pressure. It's also possible that they may be cautioned not to attend the event at all. Remember that grandma who went viral about a year or two ago when she was shouting? I think it was her 70th birthday party, and she was really pissed off that some people attended. Quite a lot of people apparently attended and they didn't purchase the material. But the funny part is that these sentiments aren't new. Back in 1944, over 80 years ago, the Daily Service had a columnist, Remy Aiyinke, who wrote a lengthy article about Aishaayanx. She wrote, "The custom has lent itself to much abuse, in that the occasions for celebrating marriages and funerals occur so often that one may be asked by friends to buy Aishaayanx more than 10 times a year. If you buy Aishaayanx when one friend celebrates an occasion and fails to buy when another celebrates her, you are in for trouble because the latter looks on you as an enemy. Aishaayanx is responsible for much trouble in the country." And then she goes on to write, "Since very few of us can actually afford to look grand and gay at every function, those who cannot will fall into the vices in order that they may be compared with the greats. The responsibility for the continuation of this evil custom lies much on the shoulders of the young husbands and fathers and mothers who give money to their wives, children and daughters in order that they appear grand and gay amongst the crowd." That was basically a very articulate way of describing the I better pass my neighbour mindset in 1944. Also, it's very well known that those who participate in Aishaayanx are recipients of more privileged gifts, and some argue that they may even receive preferential treatment. Overall, it can influence people to just perform socially even when they do lack the financial means to do so. We've finally arrived to the last and my favourite part of this discussion, and that's the matter of sustainability, consumerism and the decline of the local market. So this widespread and almost aggressively endorsed phenomena raises some serious concerns regarding sustainability, and I'm not being alarmist. It's created a huge shift in demand towards mass-produced factory products, which of course are imported, and from where, you ask? China. But why? People want cheap, they they want fast, and they want easily accessible materials. Think fast fashion, think overconsumption. Nigeria is not exempt to this. And data shows us that this has had a real impact in the domestic textile market in Nigeria. Aishaayanx, which is typically hand woven, China is producing that now. Of course, the lace, the adire, the ankara, made in China. Even the process of making Aishaayanx is quite similar to the kente fabric by the Ghanaians. It's hand woven, it's very intricate, and it does take a lot of time. In fact, as a consequence, almost all textile factories in Nigeria have closed down. Happy days, except not really. Now, over the years, the government has tried to step in to revive the industry. In 1972, there was the indigenization decree, basically tried to ban foreigners from dominating the textile industry and transferring more control and ownership to Nigerians in the textile industry, but this flopped. And that's because there were actual structural issues such as lack of resources and infrastructure that was actually negatively affecting the industry. And obviously that policy didn't address those matters. You know, Nigeria has a tendency of sticking a plaster on something as opposed to actually doing surgery. By the 1990s, the policy was scrapped and Nigeria decided to embrace a more open market approach. By this time, the textile industry was on its knees. Businesses struggled to survive and profitability plummeted. It didn't do much better in the 2000s either. Again, same issues, lack of good infrastructure, lack of modernization of equipment, challenges with oil and corruption all worked to mess up the industry even further. Might I add, it was said that customers preferred imported goods as opposed to locally made. So that was definitely helpful in reviving the industry. Some interesting consumer behavior. Rice explains that prices of Chinese imports were set so low that the competition was nearly eliminated, and any attempt at regulating the trade was undermined by rampant smuggling, counterfeiting, and government corruption. By 2007, The Guardian reported that 80% of Nigeria's textile markets were dominated by Asian imports. Approximately 170 manufacturers closed by 2008. Ultimately, Nigeria's textile market has really struggled, being inundated with importations and the Chinese textiles. There's just absolutely no competition whatsoever.
I produce blanket and my cost of production will be around 3,000 to 4,000 naira, while someone is bringing that same blanket and selling it here in the market at 2,000 naira, half of my cost of production. How can I compete with that?
At one point, either during Goodluck Jonathan's tenure or Muhammadu Buhari, they did plunge billions of naira into the industry to try and resuscitate it, but it just didn't work. They just don't address issues properly. We don't even have constant electricity. How about that? How is that good for business? Businesses will not thrive in shitty conditions. To my actual misery, there was recently some guy on Twitter from Nigeria stating that, you know, the fact that we don't have 24 hours electricity isn't all that bad and we don't need it to be productive. And all I have to say is well done, Nigeria, for completely messing up the cognitive function of your citizens. How have we gotten to a point where people literally believe that we don't need 24 hours electricity? What?
Let me just go in the bush and weep. I just have to go in the bush and weep. Really. I don't understand. I swear to God, I don't understand.
We are in a big shit, I tell you that. As of 2022, foreign imports now constitute 80 to 90% of the market. And to just lightly touch on the point of sustainability, oftentimes Aishaayanx garments tend to be just worn once, and then after the event is over, it's left to collect dust in the closet, which means that we can essentially categorize it as a form of disposable fashion. It does contribute to clothing waste. It's rarely ever repurposed. I know that men do have a bit of a difference here because they tend to wear their things again. So now it poses ethical questions about a trend or cultural practice that promotes single-use garments. It's well beyond time to start considering its environmental impact and the need for responsible consumption as part of Aishaayanx. So now that's all said and done, here are my final thoughts. Aishaayanx hasn't completely succumbed to commercialization. It is still a nice cultural practice which does symbolize our support for one another. It does look great too. However, the culture is evolving. Therefore, it is really important to remain mindful of its trajectory, and we should start to evaluate whether or not its manifestations are more detrimental than beneficial. So, Is Aishaayanx the evil custom as said in 1944? Well, I'm sure your answer will be contingent on whether or not you've recently received a very hefty bill. And thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe. It's really good for my channel. Also, please do leave me a comment. I really enjoy reading them, and I shall see you next time.